The demolition crew was already backing their excavator off the trailer when I stepped out of my farmhouse, coffee mug in hand, watching 60 years of family history about to be reduced to splinters and dust. Karen Whitfield stood beside her silver Mercedes, arms crossed, wearing that victorious smirk I'd grown to hate over the past 6 months. She'd finally gotten her court order, and my grandfather's 1890s cattle barn, the heart of our family ranch, had exactly 1 hour left to exist. "I told you this day would come, Mr. Harrison," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through the morning air. Non-conforming structures have no place in Meadowbrook Estates. Time to join the 21st century. What Karen didn't know, as she supervised what she thought would be my complete humiliation, was that 3 months earlier, I'd quietly arranged for that same non-conforming structure to be designated as a protected historical landmark by the National Register of Historic Places. The same registry I'd served on for 12 years as the regional coordinator for agricultural preservation. The same authority that could not only stop her demolition, but potentially shut down her entire HOA's aggressive development plans. I set my coffee on the porch railing and pulled out my phone, dialing the number I'd been saving for exactly this moment. "Sheriff Martinez? This is James Harrison. I need you to stop an illegal demolition in progress at my property." "Yes, I have the paperwork right here." Karen's smirk began to fade as she watched me make the call, but she had no idea that her war against my barn was about to backfire in ways that would reshape the entire Meadowbrook community forever. 8 months earlier, I'd been living peacefully on the 47-acre ranch that had been in my family for 4 generations. After 30 years as a high school agriculture teacher, I'd retired early to restore the property to its original glory: rolling pastures, heritage fruit orchards, and the magnificent 1,890 timber frame barn that my great-grandfather had built with his own hands, using oak beams cut from trees on the property itself. The ranch sat on what used to be the outskirts of town, but suburban sprawl had gradually crept closer over the decades. When Meridian Development Corporation announced plans for Meadowbrook Estates, a luxury subdivision of McMansions starting at $800,000, I wasn't particularly concerned. My property was zoned agricultural, protected by county ordinances, and completely separate from their development. That's when I first encountered Karen Whitfield, though at the time she was just another real estate agent showing properties to wealthy clients from the city. She'd pull up to my fence line in her Mercedes, gesturing dismissively at my barn while explaining to potential buyers how that old eyesore will be gone once the area is properly developed. I should have paid more attention to those conversations. The first warning sign came when I received a letter from something called the Meadowbrook Estates Community Standards Committee. The letterhead was professionally designed, complete with a logo featuring a stylized manor house and perfectly manicured trees. The message inside was polite but firm. My property, while not technically within the subdivision boundaries, was visually impactful to the community aesthetic and needed to align with neighborhood standards. I threw the letter in the trash. My ranch wasn't part of their subdivision, and I had zero obligation to follow their manufactured rules about what constituted appropriate community standards. But Karen Whitfield wasn't the type to give up easily. 2 weeks later, she showed up at my front door with a clipboard, a camera, and that same fake smile real estate agents perfect in training seminars. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Karen Whitfield, president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. I think there's been some confusion about property boundaries and community obligations." She'd done her homework. I had to give her that. Somehow, she'd discovered that a small corner of my ranch, maybe 2 acres of unused pasture, fell within a utility easement that the county had granted to serve the new subdivision. In Karen's twisted interpretation of property law, this meant my entire ranch was subject to HOA oversight. Obviously, we're not asking you to follow residential guidelines, she said, taking photos of my barn from every angle. But structures visible from community properties need to meet basic aesthetic standards. This barn, for instance, is clearly in violation of our architectural guidelines. I explained that my barn was built in 1892, was listed on the county's Heritage Property Registry, and wasn't subject to any HOA authority regardless of utility easements. Karen nodded sympathetically while continuing to take photos, then handed me a formal violation notice demanding the barn be brought into compliance or removed within 90 days. "I'm sure we can work something out," she said with that practiced smile. "Perhaps a nice storage shed with vinyl siding? Something that fits the neighborhood character?" That's when I realized Karen Whitfield didn't just want to control her subdivision, she wanted to control everything she could see from it. And my barn, standing proud and weathered against the skyline, was apparently offensive to her vision of suburban perfection. Over the following weeks, I researched Karen's background and discovered a pattern that should have terrified anyone considering buying property in Meadowbrook Estates. She'd served as HOA president in 2 previous communities, both of which had earned reputations for aggressive enforcement and litigation against residents. Property values in her former neighborhoods had actually declined due to the hostile atmosphere she'd created. But her tactics were effective. She'd managed to force out 3 families from her current subdivision by drowning them in violation notices, fines, and legal fees until they sold their homes just to escape the harassment. Her latest target was elderly Mrs. Rodriguez, whose non-conforming rose garden had resulted in $12,000 in accumulated fines and a lien against her property. Karen's strategy was simple: identify anything that didn't perfectly align with her personal aesthetic preferences, declare it a violation, and escalate enforcement until the property owner either complied or left. My barn, visible from several homes in her subdivision, had become her white whale. The violation notices escalated quickly. First came demands for structural improvements to make the barn architecturally consistent with community standards. When I ignored those, she cited me for inadequate maintenance of what she claimed was a deteriorating structure affecting property values. The fines started at $250 per month and doubled every 30 days. But Karen's biggest mistake was underestimating exactly who she was dealing with. During my 12 years on the National Register of Historic Places Committee, I'd become an expert in historic preservation law, agricultural property rights, and the complex regulations that protect heritage structures from exactly the kind of harassment she was attempting. More importantly, I had connections throughout the state's historical preservation network, including architects, lawyers, and government officials who specialized in protecting irreplaceable agricultural heritage from suburban development pressure. The turning point came when Karen filed for a court injunction demanding immediate removal of my barn, claiming it was a public nuisance that posed safety risks to the community. Her legal filing was 43 pages of manufactured complaints, doctored photos, and expert testimonies from consultants who'd never actually visited my property. Reading through her injunction request, I realized Karen had made a fatal error in her research. She'd assumed my barn was just another old farm building with no special protections. She had no idea that I'd been quietly working for 3 months to have it designated as a protected historical landmark, not just at the county level, but through the National Register of Historic Places. The process had been complex and time-consuming, requiring detailed architectural surveys, historical documentation, and approval from multiple levels of government bureaucracy. But I'd had advantages that most property owners don't. I knew exactly which forms to file, which officials to contact, and how to navigate the system efficiently. By the time Karen filed her injunction, my barn wasn't just a private building on agricultural property. It was officially protected by federal historic preservation law, with penalties for unauthorized alterations or demolitions that included massive fines and potential criminal charges. But I decided not to reveal this information immediately. Instead, I wanted to let Karen dig herself deeper into a legal hole that would have consequences far beyond just my property. I hired Margaret Chen, the best agricultural property rights attorney in the state, and prepared for what I knew would be Karen's most aggressive assault yet. Margaret had successfully defended dozens of family farms against HOA overreach, and she was eager to add Karen Whitfield to her list of defeated opponents. "This is going to be fun," Margaret told me after reviewing Karen's injunction filing. "She's made so many legal errors that I could probably get this dismissed on procedural grounds alone. But let's see how far she wants to take this." Karen's confidence was unshakable, even when Margaret filed our initial response pointing out the numerous flaws in her legal arguments. At the preliminary hearing, Karen showed up with 2 lawyers, a structural engineer, and a thick binder of evidence supposedly proving that my barn was a threat to public safety and community property values. Judge Rebecca Santos listened patiently to Karen's presentation, which included dramatic photos of weathered wood siding, claims about hazardous structural conditions, and testimony from her hired expert about how deteriorating agricultural structures negatively impacted residential property values. When it was our turn to respond, Margaret stood up with a single folder containing 3 documents: the original 1,892 construction records for my barn, the county's heritage property designation, and a letter from the state's chief historical preservation officer, describing the barn as an exceptional example of late 19th century agricultural architecture. "Your Honor," Margaret said calmly, "the plaintiff is asking this court to order the destruction of a historically significant structure that represents irreplaceable agricultural heritage. Before considering such a drastic remedy, I believe the court should review these materials." Judge Santos spent 15 minutes examining our documents, while Karen and her lawyers whispered frantically among themselves. Finally, the judge looked up with what might have been the hint of a smile. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm curious about your authority to demand modifications to a heritage property that isn't located within your HOA's jurisdiction." Karen launched into a confused explanation about utility easements and community impact, but Judge Santos cut her off. "I am scheduling a site inspection for next week. All parties will meet at the property so I can evaluate these claims personally." That's when I knew Karen was about to walk into a trap entirely of her own making. The site inspection was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in October, and Karen arrived with an entourage that looked like she was planning to film a documentary about HOA enforcement. Her 2 lawyers, her structural engineer, a photographer, and 3 members of her architectural review committee all piled out of various luxury vehicles, armed with cameras, measuring devices, and clipboards. Judge Santos arrived in her own car, followed by Margaret and me. But I'd also arranged for 3 additional guests who would transform the entire proceeding: Dr. Patricia Williams, the state's leading expert on 19th century agricultural architecture, Thomas Mitchell, regional coordinator for the National Register of Historic Places, and Sheriff Martinez, whose presence would become critically important in about 30 minutes. "Before we begin the inspection," I announced, "I have some additional documentation that's relevant to these proceedings." I handed Judge Santos a certified letter from the National Register of Historic Places, dated 2 weeks earlier, officially designating my barn as a protected historical landmark under federal preservation law. The designation had been approved based on the barn's exceptional architectural significance and its role in the region's agricultural heritage. Karen's face went from confident to confused to absolutely pale as Judge Santos read the letter aloud. Her structural engineer started packing up his equipment, apparently realizing that his expertise was irrelevant when dealing with federally protected historic structures. "Mrs. Whitfield," Judge Santos said carefully, Are you aware that federal historic preservation law makes it a criminal offense to damage or destroy protected landmarks without proper authorization? Karen's lawyers began whispering urgently in her ear, but she brushed them off. That doesn't matter, she declared. The structure is still a public nuisance that affects our community property values. Historic designation doesn't exempt it from local safety regulations. That's when Dr. Williams stepped forward with her own thick folder of documentation. Your Honor, I conducted a comprehensive structural analysis of this barn 3 months ago as part of the federal designation process. The building is not only structurally sound, but represents some of the finest timber frame construction I've encountered in 30 years of architectural preservation work. She proceeded to give Judge Santos a detailed tour of the barn's interior, pointing out the hand-hewn oak beams, original mortise and tenon joinery, and traditional building techniques that were rapidly disappearing from the American landscape. Karen followed along, looking increasingly desperate as her claims about structural hazards were systematically debunked by actual experts. But the real surprise came when Thomas Mitchell pulled out a large map of the surrounding area and spread it across the hood of his car. Your Honor, there's something else you should know about this property. Based on our historical research, this barn isn't just a single protected structure. The entire ranch qualifies for historic district designation. The map showed property boundaries, historical structures, and agricultural features dating back to the 1870s. My ranch wasn't just a random farm that happened to have an old barn. It was the last intact example of the region's original agricultural settlement pattern, complete with heritage orchards, traditional fencing, and landscape features that told the story of 4 generations of family farming. What this means, Thomas continued, is that any development activity within a half-mile radius of this property requires review and approval from the State Historic Preservation Office. This includes new construction, major renovations, and changes to the historical viewshed. Karen's Architectural Review Committee members were staring at the map in horror, apparently realizing that their entire subdivision might fall under historic preservation oversight. Several of the planned luxury improvements to Meadowbrook Estates would require federal approval, environmental impact studies, and compliance with historic district regulations. Judge Santos studied the map for several minutes, then looked directly at Karen. Mrs. Whitfield, I'm dismissing your injunction request. Moreover, I'm referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential violations of federal historic preservation law. That's when Sheriff Martinez stepped forward. Ma'am, I need to advise you that attempting to demolish a federally protected historic structure constitutes destruction of federal property. I'm going to need you to cancel any demolition activities immediately. Karen's perfect composure finally cracked completely. This is ridiculous, she screamed. It's just an old barn. You can't let one building stop progress for an entire community. But her lawyers were already retreating to their cars, apparently unwilling to be associated with a client who was facing potential federal charges. Her Architectural Review Committee members followed, leaving Karen standing alone beside her Mercedes, staring at a barn that had suddenly become untouchable. Judge Santos handed me back the federal designation documents. Mr. Harrison, I apologize that you've been subjected to this harassment. The court will issue a permanent injunction preventing any interference with your historic property. But my revenge was just getting started. That afternoon, I called an emergency meeting with Thomas Mitchell and Dr. Williams. I want to expand the historic district designation to include the entire original settlement area, I told them. This community needs protection from the kind of aggressive development that Karen represents. Thomas spread his maps across my kitchen table, outlining the boundaries of what could become the Meadowbrook Agricultural Historic District. The protected area would include not just my ranch, but the original mill site, 2 other heritage properties, and several thousand acres of traditional agricultural landscape. The designation would require all new development to comply with historic preservation guidelines, Dr. Williams explained. No more McMansions, no more destruction of heritage structures, no more aggressive HOA enforcement against traditional agricultural uses. But the most satisfying aspect of the historic district designation was how it would affect Karen's subdivision. Under federal historic preservation law, any development visible from protected historic properties had to be compatible with the historic character of the area. Meadowbrook Estates, with its massive houses and suburban landscaping, was about as incompatible as possible with 19th century agricultural heritage. The legal implications were staggering. Every house in Karen's subdivision would need to be evaluated for compliance with historic district standards. Property owners might be required to modify or remove non-conforming structures, landscape features, and architectural elements that disrupted the historical viewshed. More importantly, Karen's HOA would lose its authority to enforce aesthetic standards that conflicted with historic preservation requirements. Traditional agricultural uses, heritage building materials, and historical landscape features would take priority over her suburban vision of community conformity. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing the most comprehensive historic district application in state history. The documentation included architectural surveys, historical photographs, genealogical records, and detailed maps showing how the area's agricultural heritage had been preserved on my family's ranch despite suburban development pressure. But I also included something else, a complete record of Karen's harassment campaign, her violations of property rights law, and her attempts to destroy irreplaceable historical structures. I wanted the State Historic Preservation Office to understand exactly what kind of threats the area's heritage was facing. The application was approved in record time, creating the 3,400-acre Meadowbrook Agricultural Historic District with my barn as its centerpiece. The designation came with strict development guidelines, mandatory review processes for any construction activity, and federal enforcement authority that superseded local HOA regulations. Karen received the Historic District notification on a Friday afternoon, along with a formal cease and desist order from the State Historic Preservation Office, demanding that her HOA stop all enforcement activities against traditional agricultural uses within the protected area. But the real shock came when she discovered that 13 homes in her subdivision were now classified as non-contributing structures that detracted from the historic district's agricultural character. Under the new guidelines, these properties would need to be modified or potentially removed to restore the area's historical integrity. Karen called me that evening, her voice shaking with rage and desperation. "You've destroyed our entire community," she said. "Property values are going to collapse. People will lose their investments. All because you couldn't just replace one old barn." "Karen," I replied calmly, "I tried to explain that my barn was historically significant and legally protected. You chose to ignore that information and pursue illegal demolition. This is what happens when you attack irreplaceable cultural heritage." But the whole subdivision, all those families, should have considered the historical significance of the area before building houses that were incompatible with agricultural heritage. Maybe next time you'll do your research before trying to destroy something that took 4 generations to build. I hung up the phone and poured myself a glass of wine made from grapes grown on my heritage orchard, the same orchard that was now protected by federal law from any future development pressure. The consequences for Meadowbrook Estates were swift and devastating. Within a month, 3 families had put their homes on the market after receiving notices that their properties violated historic district guidelines. The subdivision's planned expansion was permanently blocked by environmental and historic preservation reviews. Most satisfying of all, Karen's HOA was stripped of its authority to regulate properties within the historic district. The Architectural Review Committee was dissolved, violation notices were invalidated, and residents were free to pursue traditional agricultural activities without interference from suburban aesthetic standards. Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman whose rose garden had resulted in $12,000 in fines, received a formal apology from the state and was designated as the caretaker of the district's Heritage Garden program. Her non-conforming roses were now protected as examples of traditional agricultural landscaping. But Karen wasn't finished causing problems. 2 months after the historic district designation, she filed an appeal with the federal court system, claiming that the preservation requirements constituted an unconstitutional taking of private property rights. Her new legal strategy was ambitious and expensive, involving constitutional law experts, property rights organizations, and a media campaign about federal overreach in local community management. She had apparently decided that if she was going down, she'd take the entire historic preservation system with her. The case attracted national attention from property rights advocates, historic preservationists, and legal scholars interested in the balance between individual property rights and cultural heritage protection. Karen positioned herself as a defender of homeowners' rights against government bureaucracy run amok. But her legal challenge had one fatal flaw: my barn and ranch weren't just historically significant by bureaucratic designation. They were genuinely irreplaceable examples of American agricultural heritage, with documentation stretching back 130 years and architectural features that couldn't be recreated with modern construction technique. Margaret Chen assembled a legal team that included constitutional law experts, historic preservation attorneys, and agricultural rights specialists. Our defense strategy was simple: demonstrate that protecting irreplaceable cultural heritage was a legitimate government interest that justified reasonable restrictions on incompatible development. But when Judge Patricia Morrison called the hearing to order, it was clear that Karen had fundamentally misunderstood the legal landscape surrounding historic preservation law. Judge Morrison had written several landmark decisions supporting cultural heritage protection, and she wasn't sympathetic to arguments that property rights should take precedence over irreplaceable historical resources. Karen's lead attorney spent 2 hours arguing that the historic district designation was overly broad, economically destructive, and based on insufficient historical evidence. He presented testimony from real estate appraisers, development economists, and property rights advocates who painted the preservation requirements as an assault on suburban homeownership. When it was our turn to respond, Margaret stood up with a single exhibit: the original 1892 construction contract for my barn, signed by my great-grandfather and written in his own handwriting. She read the document aloud, describing how he'd selected specific oak trees from the property, hired local craftsmen who'd learned traditional building techniques from German immigrants, and created a structure designed to serve his family's farming operation for generations. "Your Honor," Margaret said quietly, "this isn't about government overreach or property rights conflicts. This is about preserving the last intact example of the agricultural heritage that built this region. Once structures like this are destroyed, they can never be replaced." She was followed by Dr. Williams, who provided expert testimony about the barn's architectural significance, and Thomas Mitchell, who explained how the historic district designation was essential to protecting the cultural landscape that surrounded irreplaceable heritage structures. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source: Maria Rodriguez, the elderly woman whose rose garden had been the subject of Karen's harassment campaign. Maria had immigrated from Mexico 50 years earlier and had planted her garden using traditional varieties and techniques that her grandmother had taught her in their home village. "That woman," Maria said, pointing directly at Karen, "she tried to destroy my roses because they didn't look like the pictures in her magazines. But those roses, they're part of my family's story. They connect me to my heritage, just like Mr. Harrison's barn connects him to his." Judge Morrison listened to 3 days of testimony, then retired to consider her decision. When she returned to the courtroom the following week, her ruling was comprehensive and devastating to Karen's position. The historic district designation is not only constitutional, but represents exactly the kind of thoughtful cultural preservation that federal law was designed to support, Judge Morrison declared. The plaintiff's argument that property rights should take precedence over irreplaceable historical heritage is inconsistent with decades of established legal precedent. She went on to note that Karen's harassment campaign against traditional agricultural activities had actually strengthened the case for historic protection, demonstrating the real threats that cultural heritage faced from aggressive suburban development. The court finds that the Meadowbrook Agricultural Historic District serves compelling government interests in cultural preservation, agricultural heritage protection, and environmental conservation. The designation will stand as written. Karen's legal challenge was not just rejected. It was rejected so thoroughly that it established new precedent for historic preservation authority in agricultural communities facing suburban development pressure. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. The court is also concerned about the pattern of harassment documented in this case. The plaintiff's attempts to destroy federally protected historical structures appear to constitute willful violations of preservation law. She ordered a complete investigation of Karen's HOA activities, including her violation notices, fine collection practices, and enforcement actions against traditional agricultural uses. The investigation would be conducted by federal authorities with expertise in historic preservation law violations. Within a month, that investigation had uncovered a pattern of systematic harassment that extended far beyond my barn. Karen had targeted every property owner in the area who maintained traditional agricultural activities, heritage gardens, or historical structures that didn't conform to her suburban aesthetic vision. The federal investigators discovered that Karen had collected over $180,000 in fines and legal fees from residents who were simply trying to maintain their properties in ways that were consistent with the area's agricultural heritage. She'd forced 12 families to sell their homes and had prevented numerous others from pursuing traditional farming activities on their own land. The final report concluded that Karen's HOA had operated as a systematic threat to agricultural heritage preservation and recommended criminal charges for violations of federal historic preservation law. On a cold February morning, 6 months after Karen had first demanded that I tear down my barn, Sheriff Martinez arrived at her house with a federal warrant for her arrest. The charges included destruction of federal property, conspiracy to violate historic preservation law, and civil rights violations for her systematic harassment of residents based on their cultural and agricultural activities. I watched from my barn loft as the news crews filmed Karen being led away in handcuffs, still insisting that she was being persecuted for maintaining community standards. Her husband, Richard, followed in his own car, apparently having decided that his wife's legal problems weren't his responsibility. That afternoon, I received a call from the new president of Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, a retired teacher named David Garrett, who'd been elected after Karen's arrest. Mr. Harrison, on behalf of our community, I want to apologize for everything that's happened. We're dissolving the Architectural Review Committee and focusing on actual community services instead of harassment campaigns. But the most satisfying call came from Thomas Mitchell at the State Historic Preservation Office. James, I wanted you to know that your case has been designated as a model for agricultural heritage protection. We're using your documentation and legal strategy as a template for other communities facing similar development pressure. The Meadowbrook Agricultural Historic District had become the largest protected agricultural landscape in state history, encompassing not just my ranch, but dozens of other heritage properties that were now permanently protected from suburban development pressure. 6 months later, I was standing in the same spot where Karen had once supervised what she thought would be my barn's demolition, But now, I was looking at something very different. The heritage tourism program that had grown out of the historic district designation was bringing visitors from across the region to learn about traditional agricultural techniques and 19th century building crafts. My barn had become the centerpiece of weekend educational programs, where families could learn about timber framing, traditional farming methods, and the cultural heritage that connected modern communities to their agricultural roots. The building that Karen had tried to destroy was now generating more positive economic impact than her entire subdivision. But the real victory was walking through the community and seeing residents who were finally free to maintain their properties in ways that reflected their own cultural heritage and family traditions. Mrs. Rodriguez's rose garden had become a demonstration site for traditional Mexican-American gardening techniques. The Miller family had restored their heritage apple orchard using varieties that hadn't been grown commercially in 50 years. Even some of the Meadowbrook Estates residents had embraced the historic district designation, removing suburban landscaping and replacing it with native plants and traditional garden designs that were more compatible with the area's agricultural character. Karen Whitfield was serving 18 months in federal prison for violations of historic preservation law, followed by 5 years of probation that prohibited her from serving in any HOA leadership position. Her legal fees had exceeded $300,000, and her house in Meadowbrook Estates had been foreclosed after property values collapsed due to the historic district restrictions. But more importantly, her case had become a cautionary tale that was studied in law schools and planning departments across the country. The Whitfield precedent was now cited whenever aggressive HOA enforcement threatened cultural heritage or traditional agricultural activity. As I locked up the barn after the evening's heritage education program, I found a note that had been slipped under the door. It was from a family who'd visited that afternoon, a grandmother, parents, and 2 young children who'd spent the day learning about traditional farming and timber frame construction. Mr. Harrison, the note read, "Thank you for saving your barn and teaching our children about their heritage. Our great-grandfather was a farmer too, and we'd almost forgotten the stories he used to tell about the old ways of building and growing things. Today reminded us that some things are too important to lose, no matter what the neighbors think." I folded the note and put it in my pocket next to the original 1,892 construction contract that had proven so crucial in court. 4 generations of my family had worked this land, built these structures, and maintained these traditions. Karen Whitfield had tried to erase all of that in service of her suburban aesthetic vision. Instead, she'd accidentally helped me protect it forever. And sometimes, that's exactly how justice works, not through lawyers or lawsuits or even federal legislation, but through ordinary people deciding that their heritage matters more than someone else's idea of what their community should look like. The barn stood silhouetted against the sunset, its hand-hewn beams and traditional joinery now protected by federal law from any future Karen Whitfields who might mistake cultural heritage for architectural nonconformity. And I fell asleep that night to the sound of wind through oak trees that had been planted by my great-grandfather on land that would remain agricultural forever, no matter how many subdivisions might be built around it. Karen had gotten exactly what she'd demanded: changes to the community's architectural standards. She'd just never imagined that those changes would protect traditional heritage instead of destroying it.